Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 155 and I am the show's host Kyle. This episode also marks the second year of the start of Foreign Policy Focus. And so that's pretty exciting. I mean, the show has lived for a year, and not only in that year have I just kind of been active with the show, I've been pretty consistent. I've done 3 shows a week, pretty much every single Monday and Wednesday, Friday, all year. I think I did 154 shows out of the possible 150 sits, so there's a lot of content there for you guys to go and check out, a lot of good information on all the foreign policy stuff to really happen in the first year of the Trump administration. I mean, the show started right after Trump took office, and I feel like I've been on most of his big foreign policy moves since, talking about his first statement to Congress, his speech going to war in Afghanistan, his bombing of Syria in April, his national security strategy, his national defense strategy, his first State of the Union. So there's a lot of good stuff there. I mean, I've done interviews with Scott Horton, Mike Meharry, Trey Weaver, Brian Satie, Ryan Burgett, and the most frequent guest of the show would have been Will Porter, who's been on the show just several times, doing an absolute great job of breaking down critical issues, especially Russiagate and Syrian chemical weapons attack. I know there's a lot of people, that's one of the most frequent questions I'll get is about the Syrian chemical weapons attack, and I have so much content from Will Porter interviews to send him to, just explaining of how it's all lies and it's all bogus, and sometimes it's false flags and sometimes it's absolutely nothing, but it's always spun as evidence that Bashar al-Assad is the most evil person in Syria and must go. And the truth is that Bashar al-Assad is not a good person, but if you look at the things the other groups and the other actors have done in Syria, it's no wonder why a plurality of Sunnis support Bashar al-Assad and all the minority groups in Syria support Bashar al-Assad. So just to get a little bit back on track here, the show's gotten pretty good reception in its first year, and that's something, that I'm very proud of. I mean, the show's grown and taken on more listeners, but that the listeners are happy and think I'm producing good content is something I really enjoy. I know there's been a few times where I've made mistakes or gotten things wrong. I hope in all those times I've caught and gone back and hopefully the next episode said, hey, I wasn't, right about this thing and here's why it was wrong. I'd like to explain, if I read the wrong source or if I misinterpreted a source, I'd like to explain that to everyone, not, to bail myself out. But so you guys just know I'm honest. I'm just trying to tell the truth about these things that not many people tell the truth about. You have John Bolton on Fox News presenting the situation in North Korea that the United States is like throwing its hands up in the air saying, well, we sanctioned them for 18 years. There's nothing else we could have done. When before John Bolton and the Bush administration took over, the Americans, we had a successful policy and we're moving towards a situation in North Korea where North Korea was going to sign on to a very similar deal that we have with Iran where they have additional protocols on their nuclear energy regime, or on their nuclear energy program, not their nuclear weapons program, but they were willing to go along with something beyond what was mandated in the International Non-Proliferation Treaty and put additional restrictions on their nuclear energy program so that they wouldn't even be close to the ability to producing nuclear weapons. However, it was John Bolton and the Bush administration that went back on that deal and forced North Korea out of it. And so North Korea decided to produce nuclear weapons, thinking that's the only way they're going to be safe from the Americans. And at that time, you had a very blatant example of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, who, when the Americans said, no, you're cheating and you do have weapons and, we're going to kill you, he opened up his books, he opened up all of his sites, he said, you guys could come in and check everything out. And the Americans said, no, we're going to kill you anyways. And so, that's the message that the Bush administration and John Bolton said to North Korea. And so then they sanctioned North Korea. And of course, the sanctions really haven't worked because the regime in North Korea is brutal. And while the lives of the average North Korean has absolutely suffered, and during that time span, I have no idea how many tens or hundreds of thousands have starved to death. But one thing that hasn't been limited by the U.S. sanctions is the North Korean missile program and the North Korean nuclear weapons program. I'm unsure of what the actual ability of the North Korean nuclear weapons program and missile program are, but they at least have established somewhat of a consensus that they have some kind of hydrogen bomb, and they have pretty good intermediate range ballistic missiles and possibly an intercontinental ballistic missile, and those missiles can possibly support a miniaturized nuclear weapon. And so that's a real victory if you're North Korea, to be able to establish that in spite of U.S. sanctions for all these years. It was John Bolton that nuclearized North Korea. It wasn't the North Koreans' desire to go that path necessarily. And so you have those kind of lies coming out of the mainstream media. So all I want to do, is lay the record straight. With that, I guess I'll get into some of the actual news for today. I think I have a pretty cool show put together. Bad news all around pretty much, but a cool clip from Senator Rand Paul. So for those of you out there who are big fans of Rand, I'm going to be talking about him a little bit on today's show. You can find the show notes. I try to link to all the articles I talk about, or at least the ones that I think are, important details that are a little bit controversial facts. So you can find that at foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com or on the page libertarianinstitute.org. I'm always posting on the blog at the Libertarian Institute. I published articles there in the past. The show is on the homepage there, so that's another place you find all my work. The daily news roundups have all the articles and everything I read, so if you guys really want to know why I think what I think, that that's where you should go. Alright, so let's start by talking about the nuclear arsenal, which Trump has ideas to expand apparently. One of the concerning things about the Trump administration has been their push for nuclear weapons in a lot of different kinds. It seems like they're really pushing this plan of the nuclear cruise missiles, and I've kind of identified on past shows why that's so dangerous. And it's because the United States has a lot of non-nuclear cruise missiles, but if we're now putting nuclear warheads on cruise missiles, then there's a possibility every time America launches a cruise missile that's a, nuclear armed one, and, different countries are going to react much different ways to American weapons for that reason. And so it's just, another in a small step along the lines where it could very easily create a miscalculation by, several different states. That could lead to nuclear war, more easily when one wasn't, necessary. You can imagine very easily a situation in North Korea where the Trump administration decides to undergo that, quote unquote, bloody nose attack where they're going to launch some limited strikes at North Korean facilities. If the United States has nuclear armed cruise missiles and then we use cruise missiles in that strike, North Korea, I would imagine, has to calculate that those cruise missiles have nuclear weapons in them. And so that means they have to respond very differently to that attack. And not that they wouldn't respond with nuclear weapons anyways, but I think it makes this situation a little bit more likely. It also looks like Trump may have plans to expand the nuclear arsenal, I believe in terms of number of nuclear weapons. Now, I don't know how high he would be willing to go, but nuclear weapons are very expensive. They're very expensive to maintain. And while I, typically am not the, Greenpeace kind of guy, I don't think you should dump oil down a drain or throw plastic bags out the window of your car, but anyways, not really relevant. However, nuclear weapons are like, the kind of the dumping oil down the drain or throwing plastic bags out of the, side of your car. They're really bad for the environment and unnecessarily so. And so Trump's looking to make more of them. It could create a situation where some long-standing treaties and agreements between nuclear powers start to break down. This could cause America's enemies and, Russia, which, I shouldn't say American enemies. I should say that it should cause Russia to feel more threatened by the United States nuclear arsenal and possibly expand their same with China. And, India is another nuclear armed state, and while they seem to be moving closer to the U.S. orbit these days, there's still the possibility that they would maybe look to increase nuclear weapons as well to keep up with other countries. Now, it's just important to remember that all this is built on nonsense and lies. Russiagate is an absolute lie. I think that truth is coming out more and more every day, where it seems like now this is kind of blowing up in the face of the never-Trumpers and the Russiagators, who have been, for all these years, crying about Trump not all these years, this year and a half now, I guess, crying about all these Trump administration ties with Russia and everything else, when it looks like a British spy created a fake dossier on Trump that ends up being at least critical to the FISA warrant used to spy on the Trump campaign. That sounds like a conspiracy theory within itself, but this is what's being shown to have, happened within the Obama administration during the 2016 election. And so this idea that, Russia is a constant threat to the United States, constantly looking to undermine us everywhere. Remember, this wasn't Trump's perspective in 2015 and during most of the campaign. When Trump was out there saying, well, I don't know why we can't get along with Russia. I don't know why I can't get along with Putin. Why shouldn't we work together in Syria? Remember, back then, Trump was saying, U.S. troops really don't need to be in Syria, and we could partner together to fight ISIS. Because that's what everybody was talking about what Russia was doing, or at least on the Trump side, back in 2015, 2016, is that Russia was in Syria, but they were there to fight ISIS and Al-Qaeda just like the United States was, and why can't we work together? And then, he gets elected president, and now Assad must go, and Assad's the worst person in the world, and Russia's terrible for helping them, and they're undermining the United States by propping up Assad and all this other ridiculous junk. Another lie that gets us into this kind of mess is the European and the NATO issue with Russia, which of course is one of the big reasons why we have all the nuclear weapons and the buildup more and more into Eastern Europe. But we had either in 2014 or 2016, I can't remember which year, the Dutch foreign minister said that he overheard Vladimir Putin saying that he was looking to expand Russia or something that amounted to that. Now, this caused a lot of fear and was used among the think tankers and the NATO people, all saying we need more expansion to combat Russian aggression. Well, it turns out that he now admits he lied to this. I'll link to this article in the show notes page. And I guess it's just an amazing admission. And it never turns the tables. It's not like everybody then goes, oh, well, since this was a lie, we should all reevaluate the United States' relationship with Russia. It's now, well, that was a lie, but now the status quo is this, and so we can never, go back and reevaluate the relationship. We just need to look at it now, and now it's hostile. Another big thing we have going on in the United States is the budget. Now, when it comes to the military, I think the military is used more as a pawn in the greater politics game of the United States. They're always saying, well, a government shutdown is going to hurt the military because troops won't get paid and jobs won't get done and all this other stuff. From my understanding and from my conversations with, troops overseas and everything else, there's really no impact to the U.S. operations by government shutdowns. It's not like they're doing less missions or they're less safe. It's kind of like how in the United States, when we have a government shutdown and they stop the White House tour so little kids can't go to the White House, and they close open-air World War II monuments so veterans, disabled veterans in wheelchairs who are World War II vets going to look at the memorial one last time before they die. Well, now they can't come visit. However, the congressmen still get paid, right? I mean, it's just it's a giant joke, and it's a lot of theater. Anyways, one of the congressmen that's really been standing up against the budget is Rand Paul. And even though he's a Republican, he's still good on a lot of this military stuff. And I want to play a couple clips. He was on Neil Cavuto and taking some heat from people like Senator Lindsey Graham for forcing, I think, like a 3-hour government shutdown. Again, this is all theater. However, in doing so, he gets to now, talk on some of these Fox News shows, and he made some really strong points for the, non-interventionist message. So I'll go ahead and play the first clip.
And frankly, there have been loud voices saying, we have to, dramatically increase the military budget. We've doubled the military budget since 9/11, 2001. We've doubled it. We've had an enormous amount of spending. We just have too much war. The war in Afghanistan is costing us $50 billion a year.
Mattis is wrong when he was bemoaning the plight that the Defense Department is in, and those
we'd have a lot more. We'd have a lot more money, and I could give a raise to every soldier out there if we just come home from Afghanistan. It's time to come home. There is no military victory there, and I said the other day, you guys want to have a parade? Let's bring them home from Afghanistan. All 14,000 of them. Declare victory. We got the enemy. We killed bin Laden. Our problem is in our foreign policy is that we do not know how to declare victory. We continue to fight and fight and fight to try to create a nation, and we're just not very good at nation building. It's time to come home and do some nation building in our country.
All right, so this is awesome, especially to hear from a U.S. senator. I mean, there's some things that I would have said differently and I would have phrased differently, but, man, this is a U.S. senator talking on a mainstream show, 4 p.m. This interview is probably occurring 4:30 Eastern time, and it's about a big standing issue. The interview itself is framed in the context of the budget debate and Rand Paul shutting down the government. So a lot of people are turning into this interview, and what they heard was the U.S. military budget has doubled since 9/11. Now, every day you'll hear out there Lindsey Graham and John McCain and General Mattis saying, oh, the U.S. military is crumbling and our military capabilities are eroding and our military has atrophied, even saying that. But we've doubled the budget. And so, if things aren't getting done, it's because they are doing something wrong, not because they're not getting enough money like they claim. Rand Paul points out what they're doing wrong is they're waging too much war. Right. I think this is a critical point because everybody's always talking about how the United States military needs to do more. And he's saying, whoa, we're already doing too much. So that's another great thing to hear. He points out the $50 billion that the United States will spend on the war in Afghanistan in 2018. That could be, Lindsey Graham talks about, our troops need wages and to make more money. Well, then stop fighting a pointless war in Afghanistan. Give the money to the troops. Bring them home. Use $1 billion of that dollars to throw a parade to Trump for declaring the war on hell. If Trump ends the war in Afghanistan, the man deserves a parade. I mean, that thing's been going on for 16 years. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions, have died. It's an absolute bloodbath in Afghanistan right now. If you look at the, terror attacks that are being carried out in the city of Kabul, over 100 people dying when somebody drove an ambulance into a crowded area. I mean, these are horrific things that are happening because of the continued American occupation of Afghanistan. And so, yeah, let's end it. Let's bring the troops home. And if that means we have to, use that money to give the troops a raise and to throw Trump a parade, well, that's a very small price to pay for a lot less dead Afghanis. One of the points he makes that I think is very interesting, and I think this is definitely a selling point to Trump, is that the United States just hasn't declared victory because we don't know how to. We killed bin Laden. All the Al-Qaeda guys got kicked out of Afghanistan. We should have said, hell, we won. Go America. And we should have done the same thing in Iraq. He doesn't say this, but I'm sure it's implying that, we should have done the same thing in Iraq after we killed Saddam. And we should do the same thing in Iraq and Syria right now that the Islamist State is gone. Say, go Team America. We won. We beat the terrorists. We beat the bad guys and just come home. And again, while I'm not a big fan of America claiming that these wars were victories for us, because they most certainly haven't been. If that's what it means to end the killing, then maybe that's what we need to do. He also points out that America is no good at nation building. I think to a certain extent that, this has been more or less accepted, that the term nation building isn't something that anybody really wants to stand on or stand for anymore. That being said, they continue to do it. And so rather than Rand Paul talking about how we're no good at nation building, he should just try to focus on maybe that we're still doing it even though they claim they're not. Now he has a second portion to this clip, and I'll go ahead and play it here.
I'm sure Defense Secretary Mattis will disagree with your assessment there. He says the defense is in dire need, and you hear about all the ships and everything need repairs, etc. You disagree?
If you fight in 7 different wars simultaneously, you're probably going to be short of things you want. We have no business left in Afghanistan. There's no military mission. We also have no dog in the fight in Yemen. The quadrating off and preventing food from going into Yemen has 17 million people on the verge of starving. They had 500,000 people in a cholera epidemic, maybe the world's worst cholera epidemic recently, all because Saudi Arabia is trying to impose their will on a poor, impoverished neighboring country. And so there's a lot of war we don't need to be involved with. We need to have a strong military to defend our country, but we don't need to be involved in everybody's business everywhere around the world.
Again, absolutely awesome things to hear in the mainstream media. We have Rand Paul point out America's fighting in 7 different wars. Now, it would have been really cool if Rand had put Neil on the spot and said, what 7 countries are we fighting in right now? Because I don't think Neil would have known, even though he may be one of the more relatively informed people in the mainstream media. But most senators, I don't think would know. I mean, if Rand Paul handed out a quiz to all of his other senators that just, asked which countries are Americans waging wars in, which countries do we have troops deployed in, and which countries are we conducting special forces operations in, maybe somebody, 1 or 2 people get over 50%. I mean, I would imagine it's pretty low. I saw a congressman or a senator, I forget who, on Twitter yesterday complaining about how the Israel attack in Syria, it was starting a new portion of the war, and this was kind of like a new conflict, Israel versus Iran and Syria. And this guy is such a doof, he doesn't even realize that Syria has been bombing, or Israel has been bombing Syria really since the start of the Syrian Civil War, and so this isn't anything new at all. Rand Paul again points to the United States having no business in Afghanistan. He kind of makes the point, I think pretty clearly, that, hey, there's no winning for the United States here, and this is something that Trump definitely needs to hear. Oh, and just to go back to that first part about the 7 different countries, I like how he explains it to Neil like he's a child. You're fighting in 7 different wars. Then you can't have everything you want. And this is something you have to, tell a child, is that, hey, you can't have everything you want. There's limitations on what you could have. And you can't fight a war across the entire Muslim world and, threaten North Korea all the time and carry out these huge boondoggles to Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and the weapons makers, and then at the same time try to have a military capable of fighting Russia. Like, at some point there's limits to what the United States military could have. His points on Yemen are absolutely brilliant. No dog in the fight in the Yemen, I think, isn't the best way to put it. I would, kind of point out that we're being counterproductive to American goals in Yemen because the Saudi-led war is helping the most dangerous terror group in the world, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, grow, expand, control more areas, and ally themselves with tribal fighters. And Rand Paul points out on TV, which is, it's all because of Saudi Arabia. The United States has nothing could benefit us here. Well, he could say it's detrimental. He says it's all because of Saudi Arabia, and that's a brilliant way to frame it. I'm sure that made an awful lot of lobbyists pretty upset at Rand Paul there. And he kind of just concludes there with, there's a lot of war the United States doesn't need to be in. Unfortunately, Neil Cavuto maybe then got a message from his producer. It took the conversation, the interview away from the war issue. But Rand Paul was really on a roll there. It was absolutely brilliant, and I usually bring things on to debunk them, but I thought this was so great that I wanted to bring it on and talk about it. A couple more things out of Afghanistan I wanted to discuss. First, the United States and the Afghan government are trying to issue voter ID cards. Now, one of the amazing problems with these voter ID cards is that some of the governors of the provinces in Afghanistan are protesting the cards because it labels their ethnicity as Afghan. And Afghanistan, at least to them, means land of the Pashtuns. And so for the people of northern Afghanistan, the U.S. allies there, they don't want to be labeled as Afghans because they're not Pashtuns, and they don't want to live in, to them, what would be called Pashtunistan. Just like Americans would detest the idea if we lived in Mexicostan, right? So many of us would absolutely hate that kind of thing. Anyways, I guess this points to a lot of critical things. One, the United States is trying to build a nation where there just isn't one to build. And that the idea of having elections and for these, the people of, what the United States finds as Afghanistan to continue to carry out like a fair democratic process every couple of years and elect new leadership is simply ridiculous. Also, how much worse do things have to get in Afghanistan? How many more failures does the United States have to have before we just give up? We can't even label our allies ethnicity in a way that makes them happy. If we can't even do that after 16 years, then nothing else could be said other than it's time to come home. The United States continues to wage the drug war in Afghanistan. We're finding out that it's pretty ineffective overall. The Taliban's profiting off of the opium trade in Afghanistan is pretty decentralized. And so while the United States could carry out airstrikes against drug labs or whatever else, the destruction only costs the Taliban a couple $1,000s per drug lab. Of course, there's civilians dying, and that just, benefits the Taliban cause and makes Americans even more the enemy. Also, this is the only business for people to have in a lot of areas of Afghanistan. The country's been ravaged by war for the past 16 years. And honestly, it wasn't all that good before that, right? There was a lot of war. The Soviets killed, I think, 1 million people there in the 80s. Of course, the United States armed a bunch of, Arab nut jobs in Afghanistan that were the Mujahideen, right? The precursor to Al-Qaeda was the people the United States armed to combat the Soviets there. So, of course, the country is a mess, riddled with the warlords. And honestly, the drug business is probably very profitable. Poppy grows very easily. And if you're in a situation where there's war going on, I'm sure your time preference is shortened a hell of a lot. And so I think I've read in several places that one of the main crops that could grow other than opium in some of these areas is fruit trees. However, fruit trees are expensive. They require, I think, a little bit more maintenance. They require quite a bit of investment and time investment because they sometimes don't start producing fruit right away. It takes a few years for them to grow to that point. And if you're in a situation where, you need money now because there's war on and 3 of your houses over the 16 years have been destroyed by the war and you've been displaced a couple of times, growing opium is what you could do. Despite the fact that it's completely useless, the United States continues to drop countless bombs on Afghanistan and just devastating the country for absolutely no reason. We're also now bombing a Chinese breakoff group called the Uyghurs, and you could spell it a few ways because I don't think it translates to English really well. But the way I see it most common is Uighers. And sometimes I think it's a Y instead of an I, and there's an O or a U at the end of the word. However, these are Muslim Chinese faction, and they've kind of poured into the area where Afghanistan borders with China, and the United States is now bombing them in that region. I think a lot of the people from this are, at least 1,000 have gone to fight for ISIS in Syria, so of the Uyghurs there. Mike Pence made a very interesting comment saying on the North Korean situation, if they want to talk, we'll talk. This is absolutely not the position. Pence kind of tries to make it sound like this has been the long-standing position of the United States. However, this hasn't been the position of the United States. We've been saying that they have to basically agree and take steps towards denuclearization before we'll even begin talk. A couple more things I just want to touch on. The Riyadh Ritz-Carlton is now reopened for business after Mohammed bin Salman used it for a prison and possibly a torture prison. It's very interesting how the United States always feels the moral authority to sanction Iran or North Korea or Hezbollah. But we're not going to, sanction Saudi Arabia or the Ritz-Carlton for allowing that place to be used as a political prison. Of course, this is where Mohammed bin Salman held the foreign leader of Lebanon, Hariri, and several Saudi crown princes, including the 5th richest man in the world, and a couple of the sons of the former king. And, so this was a really high stakes power move in Saudi Arabia that the United States kind of just allowed to go on. And apparently, like I said before, I don't necessarily advocate the United States do anything against it, but it's always interesting on where they decide to intervene and not to. 2 quick updates from Syria. One of the, troubles that people have had post-ISIS is that ISIS just laid landmines absolutely everywhere. And apparently 500 civilians in Raqqa have been killed or injured by ISIS landmines since this, I don't know what to call it, liberation of the city. I'm sure for the people of Raqqa, the new occupiers of the city, the Americans, the Kurds, and the allied Arab forces aren't their chosen government, and they probably like them better than the Islamic State, but they're still probably perceive it as being occupied by someone. At least 31 Turkish soldiers have been killed overall in Operation Olive Branch that continues to be a slow, bloody churn there in northwestern Syria. And Assad is apparently allowing the YPG to restock their lines and move within Syrian territory to do so. And so the Afrin enclave that Turkey is attacking, as I've explained before, is not connected to the rest of the Kurdish state. And so they had to travel through either Syrian rebel territory or territory held by the Assyrian government to get there. And the Syrian government is allowing them to do so. So that's worth noting, just to kind of see how these things are playing out. All right, that's where I'm going to wrap up the show for today. Thank you, everybody who's taken the time over the past year to share the show. Please do it some more. I really do appreciate it. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, thelibertarianinstitute.org, on Facebook at Libertarian Union, on Twitter at KYAAALE. Just give you a little teaser for Friday's show. I got a Mark Levin clip I'm going to be talking about, so I think you might all find that interesting. Anyways, see you on Friday.